A millionaire forced his daughter to marry the humble gardener as punishment. But when they met again, she said things that made him grit his teeth. Gerald Ellis sat at his desk, the vast vineyards of Napa Valley stretching out as far as the eye could see. The afternoon sunlight cast a golden hue over the hills, but Gerald wasn't enjoying the view. His mind was elsewhere, clouded with frustration over his daughter Dorothy and her latest stunt. The private investigator's report lay open in front of him, revealing her most recent defiance. Dorothy had gotten involved with a troublemaker, some rebellious young man from Los Angeles, who seemed to attract chaos wherever he went. Gerald's jaw tightened. He had given her everything: a life of privilege, a top-notch education, endless opportunities. And this was her response. He had tried reasoning with her, but Dorothy had always been stubborn, always testing the limits he set. Ever since her mother passed, Gerald had taken full control of her life, believing it was the only way to protect her from the harsh realities beyond their affluent bubble. Yet now, that control was slipping. This wasn't just about some boy anymore. It was about respect, and Gerald couldn't allow Dorothy to jeopardize her future for a foolish fling with someone who offered her nothing but trouble. He knew he had to act, and act decisively. His thoughts grew darker as he crafted a plan, one that would ensure Dorothy realized the gravity of her choices. He reached for the phone, dialing a familiar number. "Jordan, we need to talk," Gerald said as soon as the line connected. Jordan, the family's long-time gardener, was dependable and unassuming, someone who had quietly worked the estate's grounds for years. He never asked for more than a fair paycheck and the satisfaction of a job well done. And now, Gerald was ready to use him as a piece in his scheme. A few moments later, Jordan appeared at the office door. He knocked lightly before stepping inside, respectfully removing his cap as he always did. "You wanted to speak with me, Mr. Ellis?" Jordan asked, his voice courteous but tinged with uncertainty. Gerald eyed him for a moment. Jordan, in his early 30s, had the rugged look of someone who'd spent years working outdoors, with a calm and grounded demeanor. He was everything Dorothy couldn't stand: modest, content with simplicity, and utterly uninterested in the trappings of wealth. But that's exactly what made him perfect for Gerald's scheme. "Yes, Jordan, I have something to discuss with you," Gerald started, settling back into his leather chair. "It's about my daughter Dorothy." Jordan's brow furrowed, clearly puzzled. "Dorothy?" Gerald nodded, his gaze sharpening as he prepared to lay out his plan. "I'm sure you've noticed how she's been acting lately. Reckless, careless, making choices that could destroy her future. And I can't allow that." Jordan stayed quiet, though the concern on his face deepened. Of course he knew Dorothy. Everyone on the estate did. She was strikingly beautiful, sharp, and fiercely independent, the type who never hesitated to voice her displeasure. "I need her to learn responsibility, Jordan," Gerald continued. "She has to understand that life isn't all about rebellion and indulgence." "So," Gerald said, "I've decided that she's going to marry you." The air in the room seemed to freeze, and for a second, Jordan looked as though he hadn't heard him right. "Marry me?" he repeated, disbelief evident in his tone. "Yes? You're a good man, Jordan. You're hard-working and dependable. You represent everything she needs to understand. She'll see what life is like when things aren't handed to you on a silver platter. And you," Gerald added, his voice softening, "you'll be well compensated, of course." Jordan looked at Gerald, his expression hard to read. "But sir, I'm just the gardener. Dorothy, she doesn't even like me. This doesn't seem fair." Gerald waved a hand, dismissing his concerns. "It's not about whether she likes you, Jordan. It's about discipline. You'll be doing her a favor in the long run. She needs to grow up, and you're going to help her do that." A heavy silence filled the room as Jordan shifted uncomfortably, glancing out the window toward the vineyards, as if they could provide an escape from the situation he now found himself in. "I don't know, Mr. Ellis," Jordan began. But Gerald quickly cut him off. "You don't have a choice," Gerald said, with a hard edge in his voice. "Neither of you do." Jordan cast his eyes down, knowing there was no use in fighting it. Once Gerald Ellis decided on something, there was no going back. Later that evening, Dorothy came home after spending the day in the city. She walked through the mansion's grand foyer, her heels tapping on the polished marble floor, completely unaware of the storm building beneath the surface. Gerald sat waiting in the living room, his presence commanding. Dorothy instantly knew something was off. "Dorothy," he called out as she passed. She sighed, already feeling the irritation rising within her. "What now, Dad? I'm not in the mood for one of your speeches." Gerald rose from his chair, his gaze as cold as ever. "There won't be any more speeches, Dorothy. You've made your choices, and now you'll deal with the consequences." Dorothy furrowed her brow, crossing her arms. "What are you even talking about?" "You're getting married," Gerald said, his tone steady and firm. Dorothy froze, blinking in confusion. "Married? To who?" "To Jordan, the gardener," Gerald answered, locking his eyes with hers. Her initial shock quickly morphed into anger. "What? You've lost it. You can't be serious." "Oh, I'm very serious," Gerald responded, leaving no room for doubt. "The wedding is in 2 days. You will marry Jordan, and maybe then you'll learn what it's like to live in the real world." The next 2 days were a whirlwind for Dorothy, filled with disbelief and fury. She tried everything to change his mind, begging, arguing, even threatening to leave, but nothing worked. Her father had made up his mind, and there was no undoing it. Gerald Ellis was all about control, and this was just another reminder that her life was one of the many things he controlled. Dorothy stood in front of her bedroom mirror, staring at her reflection. The white dress she wore was simple, a far cry from the extravagant gown she had always imagined for her wedding day. Her hair was perfectly pinned, but her eyes were void of any joy. "I can't believe this is real," she muttered under her breath, shaking her head. Her own reflection offered no comfort. Outside, the sun shone brightly, the perfect day for a wedding in the vast gardens of the Ellis estate. Yet, for Dorothy, it couldn't have felt more wrong. To Dorothy, it may as well have been pouring. She felt suffocated, like she was stuck in a life sentence, forced into a marriage that felt more like a punishment than anything else. A sudden knock on the door yanked her out of her spiraling thoughts. Naturally, it was her father. He was there, as always, to check if she had reconsidered or maybe tried to slip away. "Dorothy." Gerald's voice was firm as he stepped into the room. "It's time." She turned to him, her eyes burning with resistance. "You know this isn't right. You know that," she challenged. Gerald remained unfazed. "It's for your own good, Dorothy. You'll understand one day." Her fists clenched tightly, resisting the urge to scream. What was the point of fighting anymore? She knew she had no choice. She'd have to see it through, but she silently vowed she would make him pay for it one day. As she followed him down the stairs and into the backyard, where a small group of guests had already gathered, Dorothy's mind raced. She could already feel the crushing weight of the future she was about to walk into. A future with Jordan, a man she barely knew, let alone loved. The humiliation was unbearable, yet it was happening, whether she wanted it or not. Jordan was standing by the archway, looking just as out of place as she felt. He was in a simple suit, his usual rugged look softened by the formality of the day, but even in his awkward stance, there was a sense of peace about him, an acceptance that made Dorothy furious. How could he be so calm? The officiant waited, smiling warmly like this was any typical celebration. Dorothy had to stop herself from rolling her eyes. There was nothing happy about this. As the ceremony began, she barely listened, her thoughts drifting to fantasies of escape, anything to avoid the life being forced upon her. Jordan's steady voice cut through her thoughts as he said his vows, looking straight at her. For just a second, something in his eyes caught her off guard. He wasn't happy about this either. Of course not. Why would he be? He hadn't asked for this any more than she had. Yet, here he was, playing his part, just like she was. When it was her turn to speak, the words felt foreign in her mouth. Alien. "I do," she whispered at last, the words barely audible, and just like that, it was over. She was now Mrs. Jordan. Whatever his last name was, she didn't even realize the full extent of it. As the ceremony wrapped up, the small crowd gave a polite round of applause, but it lacked any real warmth or joy. This wasn't a celebration, it was a mere formality. Dorothy glanced at her father, arms crossed and clearly pleased with himself. She wanted to scream, to shout at him for wrecking her life. Instead, she managed only a cold, piercing look. Jordan came up beside her, offering his arm as they made their way back to the house. She hesitated before taking it, the gesture feeling stiff and unnatural. They walked in silence, unsure of what to say. Once inside, Gerald didn't waste any time getting to the point. "You'll move into the guest house," he said, his voice cold and businesslike. "It's small, but it'll be enough for both of you." Dorothy shot him a look filled with resentment. Of course, it's small. That's the whole point, isn't it? But Gerald just ignored her. "You'll live there as husband and wife. It's time you understood what real life is like, Dorothy." She wanted to argue, but the weight of the day had already drained her of any energy to fight back. She nodded, resigned to her new reality. Jordan stood silent, his expression blank. She couldn't figure out what he was thinking, and at this point, she didn't even care. All she wanted was to be alone. Without saying another word, she walked toward the guest house, leaving Jordan and her father behind. Compared to the mansion, the guest house felt tiny, but still larger than anything she had lived in outside her family's estate. As soon as she stepped through the front door, the reality of her new life hit her hard. No more luxury, no more freedom. Now, she was stuck here with Jordan, in this small house that suddenly felt like a cage. Jordan walked in a few moments later, gently closing the door. "I'm sorry, Dorothy," he whispered, barely loud enough to hear. "I know this isn't what you wanted." Dorothy spun around, her anger flaring up. "What I wanted? None of this is what I wanted." She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. "But I guess that doesn't matter, does it? We're stuck now." Jordan nodded, his face serious. "I guess we are." They stood in awkward silence for a while, neither of them sure how to proceed. The weight of their forced marriage hung in the air, and Dorothy knew deep down that no matter what, things would never be the same again. The next morning, Dorothy woke up still filled with the same anger and disbelief she had felt the day before. The small guest house, with its cozy decor, was nothing like the mansion she had been raised in. Instead of the luxurious silk sheets and huge windows she was once accustomed to, she now found herself in a simple room with plain white curtains and a bed that creaked every time she shifted. For a while she just lay there, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince herself that this was all just a bad dream. But the clatter of dishes from the kitchen was a sharp reminder that it wasn't. This was her reality. She was married to Jordan, the gardener, and there was no getting out of it. With a heavy sigh, she threw the covers off and headed toward the bathroom. As she splashed cold water on her face, Dorothy caught a glimpse of herself in the mirror. Her hair was a mess, and her eyes were swollen from lack of sleep. She hardly recognized the person staring back at her. This wasn't the Dorothy Ellis she remembered. The self-assured, carefree young woman who could have anything she wanted with the snap of her fingers was gone. In her place was someone else entirely. Someone stuck in a life she never wanted. When she walked into the kitchen, Jordan was already at the small table, a cup of coffee in front of him. He glanced up when she entered, giving her a quiet, almost unsure smile. "Morning," he said gently. Dorothy didn't respond. She headed straight for the fridge, grabbing a bottle of water. She wasn't in the mood for small talk, especially not with the man who was now, legally speaking, her husband. It didn't matter how kind or thoughtful Jordan might seem. She hadn't forgotten the situation she was in, and she wasn't about to make it easy for him. "You should eat something," Jordan added, his voice soft but insistent. "I made eggs." Dorothy glanced at the plate of scrambled eggs he had placed on the table. They looked fine, but she had no desire to eat. Instead, she took a long drink of water and set the bottle down with a loud thud. "I'm not hungry," she said bluntly. Jordan gave a small nod, his face difficult to read, and went back to his coffee. The silence between them was heavy and awkward. The weight of their circumstances lingered in the air like an unspoken truth. She could feel his eyes on her, but she refused to meet his gaze. She had to get out of the house. It felt like the walls were closing in on her, and she couldn't take it anymore. Without a word, she snatched her jacket from the hook by the door and stormed outside, letting the door slam shut behind her. The crisp air hit her face, offering a brief sense of release, but it didn't do much to ease the tension boiling inside. The guest house sat on the edge of a sprawling vineyard that stretched endlessly across the estate. The early morning sun bathed the rows of grapevines in a soft golden light, with the mountains in the distance adding to the picturesque view. It was supposed to be peaceful, a place of calm, but Dorothy couldn't feel any of it. Her footsteps quickened as she started walking, as if the further she got from the house, the more she could outrun the anger that was clawing at her. She didn't have a destination in mind, and it didn't matter. All she knew was that she couldn't stay cooped up in that house with Jordan and the reality of what her life had turned into. As she wandered through the vineyard, flashes of her old life came to her. Shopping trips in Beverly Hills, fancy dinners with her friends, lavish vacations to exclusive resorts. Her father's absurd punishment had now stripped it all away. And here she was, stuck in this nightmare. She kicked at the dirt, scattering small rocks into the vines. "This is ridiculous," she muttered. "I don't belong here." She didn't belong with him either. For a while, she just kept walking, letting the vineyard stretch around her like an endless maze of green and gold. But as the sun rose higher, she knew she couldn't avoid going back forever. Eventually, she'd have to face the house again. Jordan would still be there, calm, patient, like he was waiting for her to acknowledge his presence. She hated how he could stay so composed, like he was fine with all of this. It drove her mad. When she finally returned to the guest house, the kitchen was empty. Jordan had cleaned up after breakfast and disappeared, probably off somewhere working in the garden. Dorothy felt a brief stab of guilt, knowing he was trying to be considerate, but she pushed it down quickly. This wasn't about kindness. This was about her life falling apart, and no amount of scrambled eggs was going to change that. She drifted into the living room and collapsed onto the couch, staring blankly at the ceiling. The hours crawled by, each one bleeding into the next, as she tried to figure out what to do next. No more parties, no more shopping sprees. What now? Her days of living the high life were gone, at least for the foreseeable future. As the evening drew closer, the door creaked open, and Jordan stepped inside, his face flushed from working in the garden all day. He wiped the sweat from his forehead and glanced at Dorothy, searching her face, though she didn't know exactly for what. "I'm going to make dinner," he said after a pause. "You're welcome to join me if you'd like." Dorothy didn't answer. She just stared, arms crossed, her face unreadable. Jordan stood there for a second, then quietly turned toward the kitchen, not saying another word. The sound of clanging pots broke the silence, and for a moment, Dorothy thought about leaving, just to escape the tension. But something held her there, though she couldn't quite put her finger on what it was. As she listened to the familiar noises of dinner being prepared, something clicked in her mind. Jordan wasn't fighting her. He wasn't arguing or pushing back against her frustration or resentment. In fact, he seemed to be giving her the room she needed to sort through everything at her own pace. It was both maddening and puzzling, but somehow it was also oddly comforting. Still, Dorothy wasn't ready to lower her defenses. Not yet. She couldn't afford to, not when she was determined to make things as difficult as possible. If her father thought she would just accept this marriage and move on, he was sorely mistaken. The next morning, Dorothy woke to the sound of birds chirping outside her window, a far cry from the city's hustle and constant traffic she was so accustomed to. For a split second, she forgot where she was until reality hit her hard. She was still in the guest house, still stuck in this forced marriage with Jordan, and nothing had changed. She sighed, running her hand through her hair as she sat up. Through the small window, she could see Jordan already back at work in the garden, bent over a bed of flowers, carefully tending to them with the same meticulousness he applied to everything. Even from where she stood, she could see the focus on his face, like the rest of the world disappeared when he was in the dirt. Dorothy moved closer to the window, watching him for a minute. She never understood people like Jordan, people who found contentment in such simple things. To her, life was about fast cars, luxury hotels, and exclusive parties. But for Jordan, spending a day working in the garden seemed more than enough. Dorothy couldn't quite wrap her head around it, yet there was a strange curiosity stirring within her. What must it feel like to live at a pace where nothing felt rushed, where everything moved in tune with nature, and fulfillment came from the soil beneath you and the effort you invested into it? She shook her head at the thought. Turning away from the window, Dorothy resumed her morning routine. She had no desire to understand Jordan or the way he lived. All she cared about was waiting for her chance to leave, to return to her real life, the life she knew best. But that opportunity felt like it was nowhere in sight. Later that day, as Dorothy strolled around the estate, she found herself drawn to the garden where Jordan was busy working. She had no plans to speak to him, but watching him among the plants, moving with a quiet kind of grace, caught her attention. Standing at the garden's edge, she observed him from afar. Jordan moved from one section of flowers to the next, his hands skillfully tending to the greenery. The focus he had was something Dorothy had never seen in anyone before. It wasn't the sharp, ambitious drive she was used to, the kind she had grown up with in her father's world of high-stakes business and deal-making. This was different. It was slower, more intentional, and oddly peaceful. As she continued to watch, Dorothy noticed something unexpected. There was no frustration in Jordan's movements, no rush to finish the job. Every action seemed deliberate, as if he enjoyed the process just as much as the outcome. He'd pause now and then to wipe his brow or study a plant more carefully, as if nothing outside the garden mattered. She couldn't help but be intrigued by the calmness in his approach, even though she still didn't quite grasp how he could be so content with such a simple life. After some time, Jordan seemed to sense her presence and looked up, meeting her gaze from across the garden. He stood up straight, wiped his hands on his pants, and gave her a small smile. "Hey," he called, walking over to her. "I didn't expect to see you out here." Dorothy shrugged, folding her arms. "I didn't have anything better to do." Jordan nodded, glancing back at the garden. "Yeah, I get that. It's not exactly thrilling around here, but it's peaceful." "Peaceful," Dorothy repeated, her voice carrying a hint of sarcasm. "Is that really all you want? Just peace?" Jordan tilted his head, thinking it over. "Yeah, I guess so. I've never really needed much more than that." Dorothy stared at him in disbelief. Nothing more? No goals? No dreams? Jordan gave a small smile, but there was something unspoken behind his eyes, something Dorothy couldn't quite figure out. "Ambition's never been my thing," Jordan replied. "I like waking up each day, knowing I get to do something I love. There's something rewarding about helping something grow, being a part of that process." Dorothy frowned, unable to grasp how someone could be satisfied with so little. But then again, Jordan never seemed like the kind of guy who chased after money or fame. He was different. "You don't get bored?" she asked, genuinely curious. Jordan let out a quiet laugh. "No, not really. There's always something to work on, something to fix, something to nurture. It's not boring when you learn to appreciate the small things." Dorothy stayed silent, unsure of how to respond. The small things, that was never her focus. Life was supposed to be big, glamorous, and filled with thrills and indulgence. Yet as she stood there, watching Jordan talk about his garden, she realized maybe she'd overlooked something important. Not that she'd ever admit it, of course. "Well, good for you, I guess," Dorothy muttered, brushing off the uneasy thought. "But I still think it's kind of silly." Jordan smiled, undisturbed by her brush-off. "You don't have to get it, Dorothy. It's just how I am." A long silence settled between them, the soft rustling of leaves filling the air. Dorothy shifted, feeling the weight of his words settle on her, like an unwelcome thought she couldn't shake. "You should try it sometime," Jordan suggested, his voice casual but sincere. "You might surprise yourself." Dorothy rolled her eyes, scoffing. "Yeah, me, gardening. Not happening." Jordan chuckled, shaking his head. "Your call." Without another word, Jordan turned back to his work, leaving Dorothy standing there, watching him again. Something unfamiliar stirred inside her, a strange mix of confusion and curiosity. She didn't get Jordan at all, and honestly, part of her didn't even want to try. Still, there was a tiny part of her, a sliver of curiosity, that wondered if maybe, just maybe, there was something she could learn from him. But she quickly shook off the thought. The simplicity of Jordan's lifestyle wasn't going to endear her. She had her own world, a world filled with luxury, thrill, and influence that was waiting for her. This was temporary. It had to be. Yet, as Dorothy turned back toward the guest house, she couldn't help but glance over her shoulder at Jordan, feeling an unexpected pull inside her, one she wasn't ready to admit. The days passed in the quiet guest house, and Dorothy began settling into a routine that felt strange, yet oddly comforting. She still felt trapped, still angry at her father for putting her in this situation. But something was beginning to change. Slowly, and against her better judgment, she started noticing things she hadn't before. It began in the mornings. Dorothy would wake to the sounds of birds singing and the sunlight filtering through the guest house's thin curtains. At first, she would just lie there, staring up at the ceiling, dreading the day ahead. But as time went on, she found herself listening to the sounds of the vineyard coming to life, the gentle breeze stirring the leaves, and the hum of life that existed beyond the walls she had built around herself. Jordan was always up before her, out in the garden, or tending to the estate. His quiet presence felt as consistent as the sunrise, and though his calm demeanor used to bother her, now she finds it strangely comforting. He never pressured her, never asked anything of her. He was just there. Of course, Dorothy kept her distance. She wasn't about to dive headfirst into this new life or fall into some romantic fantasy with the gardener. But she couldn't deny that something had shifted. One morning, as she stood by the window watching Jordan work, she caught herself feeling a flicker of admiration. He moved with a certain ease through the garden, his hands carefully tending to the plants as if he had a special connection with them. There was a rhythm to his work, a quiet confidence that came from years of experience. And despite herself, Dorothy found that she respected it. The change was gradual, but it was happening. She couldn't quite pinpoint when it began, but little by little, she found herself noticing the world around her. The vivid colors of the flowers, the warmth of the sun on her skin, the sound of the wind brushing through the vineyard. These were things she had always overlooked. Her old life had been about speed, indulgence, and getting what she wanted, whenever she wanted it. Out here, in this peaceful little spot, life seemed to slow down. For the first time, Dorothy wondered if that might not be such a bad thing after all. One afternoon, while she was outside with a book in hand, Jordan walked up to her. He was holding a basket filled with fresh vegetables, his shirt smudged with dirt from working all day. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, motioning toward the empty chair next to her. Without looking up from her book, Dorothy shrugged. "Do whatever you want." Jordan let out a faint smile and sat down. They sat there for a bit in silence, not speaking. It wasn't an uncomfortable silence, but it wasn't exactly friendly either. It was somewhere in between, awkward but somehow familiar, like the kind of quiet you share with someone you've known forever, but don't truly know at all. "I've been thinking," Jordan said after a while, breaking the stillness, "about you being here, about how things have been." Dorothy raised an eyebrow, glancing over at him. "Oh yeah? And what have you been thinking?" Jordan didn't meet her gaze. Instead, he kept his eyes on the basket in front of him, his hands fiddling with a piece of celery. "I know this isn't what you wanted, I get that. But, I don't know, maybe it doesn't have to be that bad, right?" Dorothy scoffed, her usual defense mechanism kicking in. "So bad? Jordan, I'm living in a guest house on my father's property, married to someone I barely know, because I had no choice. You really think this isn't bad?" Jordan chuckled softly and shook his head. "I'm not saying it's perfect, but you've been here a while now. You've seen how things are. Maybe it's not what you expected, but it's not the worst, is it?" Dorothy didn't reply right away. She wanted to snap at him, to tell him how absurd it was to even suggest that her situation wasn't horrible. But the words stuck in her throat, because deep down, she wasn't so sure anymore. She didn't know what to make of it all. Jordan must have noticed her hesitation, because he continued. "I'm not asking you to love it here. I just think maybe there's something small that's worth appreciating, you know?" Dorothy rolled her eyes, but there wasn't much force behind it. "What, like gardening? Is that what you're suggesting?" Jordan grinned again, this time a bit more sincerely. "You might be surprised. You're always welcome to join me." Dorothy shook her head, but couldn't fight off the small smile creeping across her face. "Yeah, I don't think so." They sat quietly for a while after that, their conversation naturally fading as the day cooled down. Dorothy watched the sun dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows over the vineyard. There was something soothing about the way the light filtered through the trees, the way the air settled into a quiet hum as evening set in. For the first time, she didn't feel the urge to bolt. She wasn't desperate to flee back to her old life. She was still mad at her dad, still frustrated with how things had turned out. But something within her was changing. She was beginning to see the world around her in a new light, noticing the beauty in things she had once brushed aside. She glanced at Jordan, who was watching the sunset with a calm, content look on his face. There was something about him that made her pause, something she couldn't quite place. He wasn't like anyone she'd ever met before. He didn't care about money, power, or status. He cared about the simple things, things Dorothy had never given much thought to. And maybe, just maybe, there was something to that. As the sun finally disappeared behind the hills, Dorothy stood and stretched her arms. "I'm heading inside," she said casually. Jordan nodded, his eyes still on the horizon. "All right. Catch you later." Walking back to the guest house, Dorothy realized she didn't hate being here as much as she once had. It wasn't perfect, and she still had no idea what her future held. But for the first time in a long while, she didn't feel completely lost. There was something peaceful about this place. And maybe, just maybe, there was something peaceful about Jordan too. The days began to blur as Dorothy continued to live quietly in the guest house. Mornings were filled with birdsong and the gentle rustle of the vineyard leaves. Jordan's steady presence had become a part of her daily routine, like the sunrise or the soft afternoon breeze through the fields. But even though her surroundings were calm, inside, she was still battling a storm of emotions. Dorothy couldn't deny that she was changing. The rage she once clung to was softening, and she hated it. She didn't want to let go of that fire. It had once driven her, giving her a sense of direction. But now, everything seemed unclear. What was she still holding on to? Her father's manipulation, no doubt. That hadn't changed. But this life with Jordan, that was getting harder to despise. One afternoon, she sat on the porch, legs tucked beneath her, gazing out at the vineyard. The warmth of the sun on her skin contrasted with the storm brewing in her mind. She hated not having an easy answer anymore. Things used to be straightforward. She was angry with Jordan, furious with her father, and frustrated with the whole situation. But now, there were moments when she felt, not happiness exactly, but a strange sense of calm, and that terrified her more than anything. Jordan was out working in the fields, as he usually was. Dorothy found herself watching him more and more these days. Not in a romantic sense, she wasn't even close to considering that, but there was something about him that intrigued her. He seemed so grounded, so at ease with the life he had created for himself. It was small, simple, everything she used to despise. Yet now, she couldn't help but wonder if there was more to life than what she had been chasing for so long. Her thoughts drifted back to their conversation from a few days ago, when Jordan had suggested there might be something here worth appreciating. She had laughed it off at the time, but now, maybe he was onto something. Maybe there was a lesson in this simple way of life. But with that realization came new complications. If she accepted that there was value in this simplicity, what did it say about the person she had been before? Had everything she once cared about been shallow and unimportant? Dorothy shook her head, trying to push those thoughts aside. She wasn't ready to face that yet. She had always seen herself as a woman of luxury, someone who thrived on the finer things in life. And yet, here she was, sitting in a modest guest house, questioning if any of it really mattered. As the afternoon passed, Dorothy grew restless and wandered outside again. She walked through the vineyard, letting her fingers glide along the grapevines as she passed. The air had cooled, and the sun was starting to sink lower, casting long shadows over the rows of plants. It was beautiful, in a way she had never really noticed before. When she reached the edge of the property, Dorothy spotted Jordan sitting on a low stone wall, hands resting on his knees, staring out across the vineyard. He looked deep in thought. For a brief moment, Dorothy paused. She wasn't entirely sure why she'd sought him out, but now that she had, she found herself at a loss for words. "Hey," she said quietly, taking a step closer. Jordan looked up, clearly surprised to see her. "Hey," he responded with a soft smile. "Everything okay?" Dorothy shrugged, unsure how to respond. "I guess I just needed to get out of the house." Jordan nodded and shifted over, making space on the wall. "Have a seat," he offered. She hesitated before sitting down next to him. For a while, neither of them spoke. The only sounds were the soft rustling of the vines and distant chirping crickets. The setting was calm, but Dorothy's mind raced. "I don't understand you," she finally said, breaking the silence. Jordan turned to her, raising an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "I don't get how you're so at peace with all of this." Dorothy gestured around her, motioning toward the vineyard. "This life, it feels so small. Don't you ever want something more?" Jordan stayed silent for a moment, reflecting on her words. "Depends on what you mean by more." "I mean bigger, better," Dorothy said, her voice growing more agitated. "More excitement, more success, more money. How are you satisfied with so little?" Jordan smiled, but there was a weight in his eyes that took Dorothy by surprise. "I guess it comes down to what matters to you. For me, it's not about money or thrill. It's about the work, about building something, growing something. That's enough for me." Dorothy shook her head, unable to grasp it. "Don't you feel like you're missing out?" Jordan laughed softly. "Maybe some people think I am, but I've never felt that way. A lot of folks get so caught up chasing after more that they forget to appreciate what they already have." His words hit Dorothy harder than she'd expected. She'd spent her whole life chasing after more money, more recognition, more everything. And now, sitting next to someone who was content with so much less, it made her question everything. "I don't know if I could ever be like that," she confessed, her tone gentler now. "I've always wanted more." Jordan nodded, his face thoughtful. "It's not about being like me, Dorothy. It's about discovering what brings you joy, what truly matters to you." Dorothy didn't reply. She wasn't sure how to respond. For the first time, she realized she didn't have an answer. She had been chasing things that didn't really matter for so long. Now, facing that reality, she felt hollow. As the sun set, casting a golden glow over the vineyard, Dorothy sensed something shifting inside her. She wasn't ready to admit it, but it was as if her old life was slowly fading at the edges. And as much as she resisted it, a small part of her began to wonder if maybe, just maybe, Jordan was right. Dorothy paced around the cozy guest house, her heart racing in her chest. She hadn't felt this kind of anxious energy in weeks, not since the wedding day. But today was different. Today, she was going to face her father. The thought had been growing in her mind for days, ever since that conversation with Jordan by the vineyard. Something had changed inside her, and even though she wasn't sure what it meant yet, she knew one thing for certain. She couldn't keep living under her father's control. The idea of confronting him filled her with both fear and resolve. Gerald Ellis had always been an overwhelming figure, a man whose presence took over every room he entered. Growing up, she quickly learned that standing up to him had consequences, and this marriage was the biggest proof of that. But now, in the quiet of the guest house, Dorothy felt a strength she hadn't known before. She was tired of living by his rules, tired of letting him run her life. She glanced out the window at the vineyard, where Jordan was working like always. There was something calming about his steady presence, even from afar. Dorothy knew she didn't have to do this, but she also knew that if she didn't face her father now, she might never break free. With a deep breath, she grabbed her jacket and stepped outside. The walk to the main house felt longer than usual, the vineyard stretching out like an endless sea of green and gold. Every step felt like a weight, as if she was heading toward a long-awaited confrontation. When she arrived at the front door of the mansion, she paused briefly, her hand hovering above the handle. Memories flooded back, glamorous parties, designer clothes, and the ever-present hum of wealth and influence. Those things had once seemed like everything, but now they felt like remnants of a life far removed from who she had become. Taking a deep breath, she opened the door and stepped inside. The grand foyer was just as she remembered it, cold, imposing. The marble floors sparkled under the chandelier's glow, but the space was devoid of warmth. It stood as a testament to her father's success, a constant reminder of what he had achieved and the price he demanded from everyone around him. Gerald, of course, was in his office. It's where he spent most of his time these days. She could hear the faint murmur of his voice through the door, likely engaged in yet another business call. For a moment, she considered waiting until he was finished, but then her resolve solidified. No more delays. She knocked once before opening the door, not waiting for an answer. Gerald looked up, clearly caught off guard by her sudden entrance. He sat behind his enormous oak desk, phone in hand, with papers strewn about. His eyes narrowed as soon as he saw her, irritation flashing across his face. "Dorothy," he said sharply, "I'm on a call. This had better be worth it." She crossed her arms, standing firm. "It is." Gerald raised a finger, signaling her to hold on while he wrapped up his conversation. Dorothy stood in silence, her jaw clenched, watching him as he issued orders over the phone. It was a familiar scene. Her father, the commanding businessman, always in control. But today, she wasn't about to be dismissed. Finally, he ended the call and leaned back in his chair, looking at her with a mix of curiosity and annoyance. "What is it, Dorothy? I'm busy." Her heart pounded, but she steadied herself. "We need to talk about the wedding, about this whole situation." Gerald's expression didn't shift, but a glint of amusement sparked in his eyes. "Ah, is my daughter finally seeing sense? Here to beg for the marriage to be undone?" Dorothy shook her head, her voice unwavering. "No, that's not it." He raised an eyebrow. "Then what? You've been sulking in the guest house for weeks. You can't be enjoying yourself." "I'm not here to talk about what makes me happy," she said, keeping her tone measured. "I'm here to tell you, I'm done letting you dictate my life. You pushed me into that marriage thinking it would teach me a lesson, but it didn't." Gerald's face darkened, though he stayed silent, allowing her to continue. Dorothy stepped closer, feeling her confidence rise. "You thought marrying Jordan would punish me, but it hasn't. In the last few weeks, I've learned more about who I am than I ever did living under your control. And I won't let you keep dictating my life anymore." Gerald stood up slowly, his tall frame casting a shadow over her. "Is that so? And what's your big plan, Dorothy? Run off with the gardener and live your little fairy tale." Dorothy stared right back, unwilling to retreat. "Maybe I will, and if I do, it'll be because it's my decision, not yours." Gerald's jaw clenched, his eyes burning with frustration. "You're being ridiculous. Do you really think you can just toss away everything I've built for you, everything this family has worked for?" Dorothy stood firm. "It's not your life to control, Dad. It's mine." The tension in the room was thick. Neither side was willing to give in. Dorothy could see the battle in her father's eyes, the struggle between his need to control her and the realization that he was losing that control. "You've always been hard-headed," Gerald finally said, his voice low, "but don't forget who you're dealing with. I'm the one who made this family what it is. I gave you everything, and this is how you repay me." Dorothy shook her head slowly. "You gave me everything, but the freedom to live my own life." The room fell into a heavy silence, her words hanging in the air. For the first time, Dorothy noticed something shift in her father's face. It wasn't the usual anger or disappointment. It was something deeper, closer to regret. But Gerald wasn't the type to admit defeat easily. He straightened, his voice turning cold and measured again. "You want your freedom, Dorothy? Fine. But don't come running to me when you figure out that life isn't as easy as you think." Dorothy nodded, her heart pounding, but her mind clearer than it had been in years. "I won't." Without another word, she walked out of his office, leaving her father behind. As the door softly closed behind her, a wave of unexpected relief washed over her. The confrontation had been overwhelming, but now it was behind her. She had spoken her mind, and for the first time in ages, Dorothy felt like she had taken charge of her life. Facing her father had stirred up a mix of emotions: anger, relief, and a surprising sense of liberation. It was the first time she had ever truly stood her ground with Gerald. Though the conversation had been difficult, it felt like a significant shift. She didn't know what the next step would be, but one thing was crystal clear. She wasn't returning to the life of wealth and control her father had shaped for her. As she walked back to the guest house, the sun was setting, casting a warm, golden hue across the vineyard. Jordan was out front, kneeling by the flower beds. His hands were caked in soil, his focus unwavering as he worked quietly. Dorothy paused for a moment, feeling a sense of calm wash over her. It had been a tough journey since their arranged marriage. Although the early days were tense and awkward, something had shifted between them. Jordan's patience and steady nature had caught her off guard. Over time, she had grown to appreciate the quiet kindness he consistently showed her. He never pressured her, never asked for anything in return. And now, after the confrontation with her father, she found herself drawn to the peaceful stability he offered. Jordan looked up as she neared, wiping his hands on his jeans. "You're back," he said softly, his voice welcoming. "How'd it go?" Dorothy sat on a small stone bench by the garden, exhaling deeply. "It was intense," she confessed, "but I finally said what needed to be said." Jordan nodded, rising to sit beside her. "Good. It was long overdue." Dorothy gave him a faint smile, glancing his way. "You think so?" "Yeah," Jordan replied, his voice calm but firm. "You've been holding on to that for a long time. It's good you finally let it out." Dorothy leaned back, gazing at the sky as it transitioned from orange to pink. "I just don't know what's next. I feel like I'm stuck between two lives, the one I left behind and the one I have now. I don't know where I belong anymore." Jordan stayed quiet for a moment before speaking again. "Maybe you don't have to make any big choices right now. Maybe you can just be." She glanced at him, caught off guard by how straightforward he was. "Just be." He shrugged, a faint smile pulling at the corners of his lips. "Yeah, life doesn't always have to be about making decisions or having everything planned out. Sometimes it's okay to just exist. Let things unfold naturally." Dorothy took a moment to let that sink in. The thought was new to her, as she had always approached life with a sense of urgency, needing to be in control to know what was coming next. But maybe Jordan had a point. Maybe she didn't need to have all the answers right now. "I'm not used to that," she confessed, her voice quieter now. "I've always had a plan. Even when I was pushing back against my dad, I was always chasing something." Jordan leaned back on the bench, his arm lightly brushing against hers, and they sat in a comfortable silence. I get it. But plans, they can change. People change. Dorothy glanced over at him, her heart skipping a beat as his words resonated with something deep inside her. Over the last few weeks, she had started to see Jordan differently. He wasn't just the gardener her father had pressured her into marrying. He was thoughtful, patient, and dependable, qualities she hadn't realized she was looking for. For the first time, Dorothy allowed herself to truly notice Jordan. His looks were rugged yet understated, his strong jawline and the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled. But more than his appearance, it was the warmth he carried. A quiet strength she hadn't even known she'd come to lean on. "What about you?" she asked, shifting the focus back to him. "Do you have a plan?" Jordan chuckled, shaking his head. "I've never really been the planning type. I like to keep things simple and just take life as it comes." Dorothy smiled, feeling a flutter in her chest she hadn't anticipated. "That sounds nice." He looked at her, his gaze softening. "It can be." The atmosphere between them shifted, and for a moment, it felt as if the world around them had gone still. Dorothy hadn't expected to feel anything for Jordan, yet here she was, sitting beside him, her heart racing as he looked at her in that way. "Jordan," she began, her voice unsure, "about this marriage." He raised an eyebrow, waiting for her to go on. "I know we didn't have much of a choice," Dorothy began, her words deliberate and measured. "And I know things haven't exactly been perfect. But I'm starting to see things a little differently now." Jordan remained silent, but his expression told her that he already understood what she was trying to say. Dorothy inhaled deeply, feeling her heart race. "What I'm trying to say is, maybe this doesn't have to feel like a punishment. Maybe we can turn it into something better." Jordan's gaze softened, and for a moment, the only sound was the gentle rustling of the vines in the evening breeze. Then slowly, he reached out and took her hand, his touch warm and reassuring. "Is that what you really want?" he asked softly. Dorothy nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. "Yeah, I think it is." Jordan's smile was small, but genuine, as he gave her hand a gentle squeeze. "Then we'll figure it out together." His simple words brought Dorothy a calmness she hadn't experienced in a long time. There were still so many uncertainties, so many things she hadn't figured out yet. But for the first time, she wasn't afraid. She wasn't alone in this anymore. As the sun dipped below the horizon and the stars began to sprinkle the sky, Dorothy felt a new warmth inside her, one that had nothing to do with the money or status she had once chased. This was different. This was real. And for the first time, she felt like she was right where she needed to be. The days following Dorothy's conversation with Jordan brought a new sense of clarity, though doubt still lingered. She had finally accepted that her feelings for Jordan were genuine, and that maybe this marriage, which she had once viewed as a burden, could be something more. But now came the hard part, the decision that would change everything. It was time to face Jordan, not as two people tied by her father's will, but as equals, as partners. It wasn't something she had ever envisioned for herself, but now it was what she wanted more than anything. One morning, as the sun bathed the vineyard in golden light, Dorothy sat on the porch of the guest house, lost in thought. A hot cup of coffee warmed her hands as she watched the world around her come to life. The vineyard, which once represented the sense of being trapped, had unexpectedly transformed into a place she now found comfort in. The peacefulness, the unpretentious life. It had slowly worked its way into her heart in ways she never imagined. Yet she knew she couldn't remain in this uncertain state much longer. It was time for her to take charge of her own path, to make the decision she had been avoiding for far too long. Her father had pushed her into this marriage as a lesson, but the choice to stay or leave was now entirely in her hands. That afternoon, she found Jordan in his usual spot, tending the garden. By the flower beds, he was crouching and trimming the plants with the same delicate precision that he always had. Watching him work had a calming effect on her, grounding her in a way nothing else could when her thoughts were spiraling. "Jordan," she called softly as she approached him. He looked up, surprised but not alarmed. "Hey," he greeted her, standing and wiping his hands on his worn-out jeans. "Everything all right?" Dorothy nodded, though her heart was pounding hard in her chest. "Yeah, I need to talk to you." Jordan's face changed, showing both curiosity and a hint of concern. "Sure. What's going on?" Dorothy drew in a long breath, trying to calm herself. She wasn't used to being open like this. But something about Jordan made it feel okay. It felt safe. "I've been thinking," she began, her voice quieter than she expected. "About us. About everything that's happened since the wedding." Jordan didn't say anything. He just stood there, letting her speak. "I know neither of us had a choice in this," she continued, nervously playing with her hands. "I know my father put us in this situation, and at first I resented it. I resented you, this place, everything." Jordan gave a small, understanding smile, but didn't interrupt her. "But now," Dorothy went on, "things have changed. I don't feel stuck anymore. I don't feel like I'm being punished. Actually, I think I might even be happy here." Her words hung in the air for a moment, heavy with meaning, like they were sharing something deep and unspoken. Jordan's expression softened, and he took a small step closer, his voice tender. "What are you saying, Dorothy?" She looked down at the ground, taking a moment to collect her thoughts. "I'm saying that I want this. I want to stay here with you, not because my father forced me into it, but because it's what I want." For a moment, Jordan's face was unreadable, like he was processing the weight of her words. Then, his face slowly lit up with a smile. It was real, genuine, the kind that made Dorothy's heart skip a beat. "You're not joking, are you?" he asked, his voice soft but filled with hope. Dorothy nodded, feeling a calmness settle over her. "I'm not joking." Jordan exhaled, a breath he didn't even realize he had been holding, and for a moment, neither of them moved. Suddenly, emotions surged through him, and he reached out, pulling her into a tight embrace. Dorothy shut her eyes, sinking into the warmth of his arms, feeling his heartbeat steady against hers. "I never thought I'd hear you say that," Jordan whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Dorothy chuckled softly, easing back just enough to look into his eyes. "Neither did I." They stood there, frozen in time, with the world around them quiet and still. For the first time in ages, Dorothy felt a true sense of peace. No anger, no bitterness, just a deep, mutual understanding that this was where she was meant to be. After a while, Jordan pulled back a little, though his hands still rested on her shoulders. "So, what does this mean?" he asked, curiosity brimming in his voice. Dorothy smiled, excitement bubbling up inside her, something she hadn't expected. "It means I want to make this official. I want to renew our vows, but this time, on our own terms." Jordan blinked, clearly caught off guard. "You mean—" Dorothy's grin grew. "Yeah, I want to marry you. For real this time." For a moment, Jordan was at a loss for words. Then, his face broke into a broad smile, and he pulled her into another hug, this time lifting her off the ground and spinning her around. Dorothy laughed, feeling lighter than she had in years. When he finally set her back down, Jordan gazed at her with an expression she'd never seen before. pure joy. "I don't even know what to say," he confessed, his voice choked with emotion. Dorothy beamed, her heart full. "Just say yes." Jordan laughed, shaking his head in disbelief. "Yes, yes, 1,000 times yes." They stood there for what seemed like forever, wrapped up in each other's arms. The vineyard stretched out around them, silent but present, bearing witness to the moment. It was simple. It was perfect. And for the first time, Dorothy felt like she wasn't chasing anything anymore. She had found exactly what she was looking for. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, they walked back to the guest house, hand in hand, speaking about the future in a way they never had before. Things felt different now. They felt real. When they reached the house, Dorothy paused on the porch, turning toward Jordan with a smile that seemed to come from the very core of her being. "Tomorrow," she whispered. "Let's make it happen. Tomorrow." Jordan nodded, his eyes sparkling with joy. "Tomorrow," he agreed. They stood there, bathed in the golden light of the setting sun, and Dorothy knew, without a doubt, she had made the right decision. The day after Dorothy's choice felt like a fresh beginning, but not everyone was happy with the news. Gerald Ellis had always believed he was in charge, that his power and influence could mold the world around him, especially when it came to his daughter's life. But recent events had shaken his confidence, and for the first time he was facing the possibility that he had lost control completely. Gerald sat in his office as he usually did, surrounded by the comforts of his wealth and success. The polished surface of his desk gleamed under the glow of the chandelier, while the scent of leather and old money lingered in the air. It was a room that exuded power, a space where Gerald had always felt at ease. But today there was no comfort, only a growing unease. He had been avoiding thoughts of Dorothy since their last argument, convincing himself that she was just being stubborn and would eventually beg for his forgiveness. Yet, as the days dragged on and he heard nothing from her, doubt began to creep in. He couldn't understand why she wasn't trying harder to break free from the life he had imposed on her. He had expected her to rebel, to come back pleading to escape the marriage with Jordan. But instead, she had done the exact opposite. She stayed. And now, he had heard rumors that she was planning to renew her vows with Jordan. This time, by her own choice. The thought enraged him. How could his daughter, his only child, settle for a life so far beneath what she deserved? How could she reject everything he had worked so hard to give her? Gerald stood up abruptly, gripping the edge of his desk as he stared out the window at the vineyard below. The vineyard had always been a source of pride for him, a testament to his achievements. But now, it felt like a cage. This was the place where his daughter had slipped out of his control. He had done everything he could to shape Dorothy into the person he wanted her to be. He'd given her the finest of everything: money, education, endless opportunities. Yet, it still wasn't enough. She continued to drift away, choosing a path he could only see as betrayal. The sound of the door creaking pulled him out of his thoughts. He looked up to find Samantha, his assistant, standing at the door, a cautious look on her face. "Mr. Ellis," she said hesitantly, "your daughter is here to see you." Gerald's heart skipped, but he quickly concealed his emotions. "Send her in," he replied, his voice cold and commanding. Samantha nodded and left. Moments later, Dorothy walked in. She looked different, more confident, more comfortable in her own skin than he'd ever seen her. It unsettled him. "Dorothy," Gerald said sharply, "what's this about?" Dorothy drew a deep breath and stood firm. "I'm here to let you know I'm renewing my vows with Jordan." Gerald clenched his jaw, but forced himself to stay composed. "I know. And what exactly do you expect me to say to that?" he asked, his voice tight. I'm not here for your approval, Dorothy replied, her tone steady. I'm telling you because you deserve to know. But this is my life, and I'm making my own choices. Gerald's eyes narrowed, his temper simmering. So you're choosing to throw everything away? Is that what this is? I'm not throwing anything away, Dorothy said, her voice calm but firm. I'm choosing a life where I can be happy, where I can be true to myself. And what about the life I built for you? Gerald's voice rose with frustration. The money, the chances I've given you, all the things I've worked for. Dorothy looked him straight in the eye, unwavering. You built that life for you, Dad, not for me. I never asked for any of it. The words hit Gerald like a slap. He had always believed everything he did was for Dorothy, that all his success and effort were for her sake. But now, standing before her, he realized he'd never asked what she wanted, only assumed he knew what was best. You're making a big mistake, Gerald muttered, his tone low and threatening. Jordan is beneath you. He'll never be able to give you the life you deserve. Dorothy gave a small, sad smile, shaking her head gently. That's where you're wrong. Jordan is exactly what I need. He's kind, reliable, and he loves me for who I am, not for my status or money. Gerald clenched his fists at his sides. You really think love is enough? You think you can survive on just love? You're being foolish, Dorothy. I'm being happy, she replied sharply, her voice more self-assured than Gerald had ever heard before. And I won't let you take that from me. The room fell into a tense silence, thick with unspoken words. Gerald looked at his daughter, his mind racing. He'd always been able to control her, bend her decisions to fit his plans. But now, for the first time, he could feel that control slipping away. And for the first time, fear crept in. Fear that he might have lost her for good. Dorothy took a step toward the door, her tone softening slightly. I love you, Dad. I always will. But I need to live my own life now. I hope one day you'll understand that. Gerald didn't respond. He couldn't. His throat felt tight, and his mind was a swirl of anger, confusion, and regret. As Dorothy quietly closed the door behind her, Gerald stood in the silence of his office, the weight of his choices crashing down on him. He had tried to dictate Dorothy's life, and in doing so, he had pushed her away. Now she was gone, choosing a path that had nothing to do with the world he had worked so hard to build for her. Gerald sank into his chair, his hands trembling as he stared at the spot where his daughter had stood moments before. He had always believed that power and control were the keys to success, that if he just held on tightly enough, he could shape everything around him. But now he understood that some things couldn't be controlled, and the cost of learning, that was losing his daughter. The day Dorothy had been waiting for finally arrived, bringing with it a sense of calm that felt almost unreal. The sun was just starting to rise over the vineyard, bathing the rows of grapevines in soft golden light. The air was cool and still. This day felt different from her wedding months ago. Back then, it had felt more like a sentence, a direct result of her father's control. Today, she felt a sense of freedom, like never before. For the first time, she was making her own decision. She stood before the small mirror in the guest house, adjusting the plain white dress she had picked for the day. It wasn't the elaborate gown she might have envisioned in the past, but it was exactly what she needed. It symbolized the fresh start she was ready to step into, a life built not on wealth or status, but on genuine love and honesty. Dorothy inhaled deeply, her heart racing with anticipation. It had been a long time since she felt this kind of joy. The past few weeks had been filled with moments of deep thought, realizations, and personal growth. She had come to understand that the life she had once chased wasn't the life that truly fulfilled her. Jordan had helped her see that, not by pushing her to change, but by being his steady, kind self. His calm presence showed her that real happiness could be found in life's simple pleasures. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. When she opened it, Jordan was standing there in a modest suit, his hair neatly in place. He looked at her with the same gentle, loving expression he always had. But today, there was something more in his gaze, something deeper, more certain. "You look beautiful," Jordan said softly, his smile sincere. Dorothy felt her cheeks flush. "Thank you," she replied, her voice soft, but brimming with emotion. "You're looking pretty good yourself." They stood in silence for a moment, simply taking in the weight of all they had gone through together, sharing the unspoken bond between them. This wasn't just a renewal of their vows, it was the start of a new chapter, one they were choosing to enter, hand in hand. "Ready?" Jordan asked, offering his hand. Dorothy nodded, placing her hand in his, more sure than ever. They walked together toward the small open space in the vineyard where the ceremony would be held. The setup was simple, just a few chairs, a wooden arch draped in wildflowers, and endless rows of grapevines stretching out behind them. The air was fresh, filled with the scent of blooming flowers and the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze. No guests, no big celebration. Just them. It was just the two of them, side by side, ready to make this decision on their own terms. For the first time ever, Dorothy didn't care about who wasn't there, or the lack of big fanfare. This felt right, exactly what she wanted. Something genuine, something real. The officiant, a kind woman from the local community, greeted them warmly as they approached. "Shall we get started?" she asked in a soft voice. Dorothy and Jordan exchanged a quick look, both smiling. "Let's go for it," Dorothy said, her heart swelling with a mix of excitement and calm. As the officiant began speaking, a wave of emotion hit Dorothy. She glanced over at Jordan, who was looking back at her with his usual steady gaze, and she realized just how much had changed since the day they were forced into marriage. Back then, they were practically strangers, two people thrown into something neither had asked for, but now they had grown into something more. They were partners, equals, no longer bound by obligation, but by choice. When the moment came for their vows, Dorothy took a deep breath, turning to face Jordan, her heart pounding. The words she had prepared didn't feel like enough, but she knew what really mattered was the honesty behind them. "Jordan," she began, her voice gentle but sure. "When we first got married, I didn't know what love was. I didn't understand what it meant to be truly happy. I thought I had to chase after things, money, status, approval, but you showed me that happiness isn't about what you have. It's about who you share your life with. You've taught me more about love, patience, and kindness than I ever thought possible. And today, I choose you, not because I have to, but because I want to. I choose you to be my partner, my friend, and my love for the rest of my life." Jordan smiled, his eyes bright with emotion. When it was his turn to speak, his voice was steady, but there was a gentle warmth in the moment that made Dorothy's heart swell in the most beautiful way. "Dorothy," Jordan said, his eyes never leaving hers, "I never saw this coming. I never imagined meeting someone like you, especially in the way we did. But the moment our paths crossed, I knew there was something extraordinary about you. You're strong, resilient, and so full of life. Every day you've shown me that love isn't about big, flashy gestures or anything fancy. It's about the small moments, the quiet times when it's just the two of us. I choose you, Dorothy. I choose you today, tomorrow, and every day to come. And I feel so fortunate to be here with you, knowing this is only the start of our story. Dorothy's eyes filled with tears as the officiant smiled and declared them husband and wife once more. There were no cheers or applause, but it didn't matter. This moment was perfect, just as it was. Jordan leaned in for a soft kiss, and Dorothy felt a deep sense of peace and fulfillment settle in her heart. This was her life now, one she had chosen not for how it appeared to others, but for how it made her feel inside. As they strolled back through the vineyard hand in hand, the golden light of the setting sun stretched long shadows across the earth. Dorothy looked up at Jordan, her heart brimming with love and gratitude. "I never thought I'd find this," she whispered, resting her head on his shoulder. Jordan smiled and wrapped his arm around her waist. Neither did I. They walked in peaceful silence for a while, the soft sounds of the vineyard filling the air around them. No words were needed. They both understood what today meant: a new chapter, a fresh beginning, and the promise of a future filled with love, happiness, and the simple beauty of being together. As the sun finally dipped below the horizon, Dorothy gazed out over the vineyard, feeling the warmth of Jordan's hand in hers, and smiled. For the first time in her life, she knew she was exactly where she was meant to be,